Death Within, Death Without. Chapter 3, First Part. The room was stocked with what looked to be weapons. There were row upon row of them, some looking like rifles and pistols, others looking like tubes resembling mortars, long spears, and swords that appeared for all the world to be made of bronze and iron, and others that seemed to be crystals fused together into weapons, the use of which was unclear. Dozens of each kind sat on the racks, gleaming. All were probably ready for immediate use. Lurie's eye was caught by a small handgun. While swords and spears were commonplace on the frontier, the much rarer firearms and laser blasters were the object of many a child's adoration. Keeping his senses keen for signs of anyone else, the boy went over to the rack near the back and reached out for the gun. The door behind him opened. As stunned as Lurie was, his body still went into action. There was a space between the two racks. Ever since entering the room, he'd had his eyes open for some place he could hide. Children who lived on the frontier were wise enough to know there was no telling when or where death might open its maw for them. Hiding himself, he held his breath. His eyes stared straight ahead. If he wanted to look at something too badly, your foe would detect your presence, and that could mean your life. Heavy footsteps entered the room. From behind them came another set, this one fairly light. The steps of an ordinary human. A burning curiosity needled Lurie, and it was coupled with fear. Who the heck is it? Are they with one of those things? The answers came from the new arrivals. This place... it's an arsenal. It was a man, his breathing so feeble it seemed it might give out at any moment. It had to be Mr. Cray. The blood chilling in his veins, the boy slapped his hand over his own mouth. Where he'd heard the footsteps, he now sensed a malevolent presence, and immediately the footsteps headed straight for him. Lurie wasn't about to sit there and silently await his fate. He dashed farther into the gap. The sound of footsteps continued. His heart seemed like it was going to explode. He could see the far end of the gap. Though he couldn't be sure, the exit seemed better than staying where he was. The boy burst from the gap like a person possessed. A black wall loomed before him. The faceless figure had just drawn its long sword with its right hand, and what looked like a pistol with its left. "Lurie? That's you, isn't it, Squirt?" he heard Cray say behind him. Why didn't the boy feel the tiniest bit of relief? Why did he think, "Don't come near me"? The pistol-like weapon was trained on his face. Green glass was set in its barrel. This was a weapon the alien that Gilzen defeated hadn't used, and when it went off, it would be the end of Lurie. The barrel of the gun whipped to the side. Light the same hue as the glass shot out, making a circular stain on the floor about 15 or 20 feet beyond the boy. The stain was glowing. Once the light faded, the floor had been burned through in the shape of the stain. The barrel was jerked back toward him, and Lurie was paralyzed. However, his foe returned the weapon to its place on its belt. Luree understood his foe's intent. It was trying to intimidate him. It pursued its prey and frightened it. And when its prey was then powerless to resist, the thing would probably bring its sword down with evil satisfaction. The enemy fell back. It speculated that it had the boy thoroughly cowed. Turning its back to him, it went over to a rack of rifles, took one down, and braced it against its shoulder. It was weird how close to a human it was in its movements. "Don't do it."
As those words were spoken, the figure that stepped between Luree and the barrel of the gun grabbed the weapon and twisted it upward. Mr. Cray. Run for it. Though the face that turned toward Luree was much paler than he remembered, it was definitely that of the Allah he knew so well. The enemy used the second arm on its right side to draw the sword from its hip. Go. Luree ran like mad for the door. In the doorway, he turned and looked. The faceless figure was just stabbing its blade into Cray's chest. Mr. Cray. Closing his eyes, the boy dashed out the door. After that, he didn't really remember what happened. His nose slammed into something. Luree could feel blood gushing from it as he fell flat on his back. He was in a corridor in the castle. The boy opened his eyes. Another of the faceless figures stood there. That wasn't all that strange. This was their home, after all. Without the slightest hesitation, the creature thrust the sword from its hip down toward Luree's face. Page break. Return. Gilson chanted before setting the summoning charm shaped like a reverse swastika on the table. He took a deep breath. This was the result of his extreme state of concentration. He sensed a presence moving behind him. Turning, Gilson looked down by his feet. There was only one being who could enter his research center despite the guard sensors. Mother dearest, what brings you here? The shadow replied in the voice of an old but still sharp woman, saying, Where has that man gone? Are you referring to Dee? Indeed I am. Ah. That you say that name so flippantly. Your confidence always runs to excess. I do not take the man lightly. Selecting a test tube from the equipment and tools littering the large table, Gilson held it up by his eye. It was filled with a dark red liquid, something a noble could never mistake. Blood. That is why I work so feverishly to accomplish my great desire in an expedient fashion. This serum should take care of everything. My dreams, and those of the damnable sacred ancestor. The shadow fell silent. There was a heavy silence, as if she'd lost her voice from the very start. Her next words were unveiled as Gilson opened the locker beside him and took out a syringe. Do you intend to repeat the same foolish sin, Duke? I came to stop that. Stop already. The sacred ancestor saw success but once. All of his later efforts were ultimately in vain. Not even you can hope. The sacred ancestor was too fixated on human beings. Gilson raised the syringe full of blood before his eye and gazed before him. He stared not at the syringe, but a black curtain that loomed behind it. "He met with a single success," said the nobleman, "but that was no more than the result of a coincidence. Therefore, he was never able to accomplish it again. His ideal cannot be reached with humans, you see. That's what I always asserted. We must seek the possibility outside, I said. What good fortune we had. They came to us, did they not? Like so." As if crazed, Gilson grabbed the cord that hung by his side and pulled it. The black curtain that towered before him parted down the middle. Behind it was a glassed-in room. A bizarre figure was hanging from the ceiling, suspended by wires. The body of the four-armed creature was stained with a hue that could only be described as bluish-green, though that was far from accurate. Its body closely resembled that of a human, but its muscles were braided like wires, and the location and form of its joints were hardly what we could call normal. That probably determined the directions its limbs could turn. Its face was as long as a horse's, but sunken in the center. Compared to its strangely large and almost perfectly circular eyes, its nose and the cruciform split that was apparently its mouth were very small, like a baby's, so that while the teeth visible in its maw were keen as a beast's, they could actually be termed cute due to their tiny size. With no help from anyone, I captured these invaders from outer space. Even now we don't know where they're from, but I saw the tremendous value in them. Their value not as invaders, but as volunteers from the stars to help us carve open the future. Gilson rapped mightily against the glass with a scepter in his hand. "This is blood. We nobles aren't a new race that suddenly came into being 10,000 years ago. Our origins go back far earlier, to the time of Earth's creation, making our kind ancient in comparison to the human race. I don't know if it's because of that or for some other reason, but at that point in time, 10 millennia ago, our species was already losing its vitality. Only the finest among us noticed it, myself and him. That is the sacred ancestor. However, he and I took the possibilities of the nobility in different directions. He tried to create a fusion of human and noble, while I wished to mix our blood with that of aliens. My experiment had begun with their arrival, and for a while I was successful. Nobles injected with the alien blood I developed exhibited strength unimaginable in our kind. And the sacred ancestor couldn't forgive you for that, the Shadow Woman said. It was the tone of one recounting a bitter memory. He was ready to dispose of all the new nobles you created, and to hurl you and this castle into the pits of eternal destruction. Before he could, I used super-advanced technology acquired from the aliens to seal the castle away in memory time. And the sacred ancestor changed my punishment to entombment deep in the earth. Gilson looked down at the shadow at his feet. All because of something you said. Mother, the sacred ancestor complied with your wishes. Why was that? Ah, the shadow said, writhing as if it quaked. Please don't ask me that. That I cannot tell you. I merely tried to save you. I am thankful to the sacred ancestor. What's done is done. I thought it was something like that. But then he came. The potential they call D. He shakes me from my principles. Gilson chuckled. You must fall, D, if I am to keep my hand on the rudder and steer the nobility into the future. I'm frightened, Gilson. My son, I have such fears. The instant I beheld that gorgeous youth, I thought I would faint. Has the sacred ancestor reappeared? I thought to myself. If that is the case, Gilson, that young man has come to bring about your end. Cast all this aside, and you and I can go somewhere where there are no humans or nobility, out among the stars. Her tone was nearly pathetic, and in response to his mother's heartfelt concern for his well-being, the son replied with this: Leave me. No desperate plea came from her. Instead, she said, I have set explosive charges on this floor. In less than 10 seconds, this accursed laboratory will be destroyed, Gilson. At her horrifying words, an evil grin came to Gilson's lips. That was all. What a foolish act for my mother to commit. It would appear you've grown not a speck wiser in 10,000 years. Gilson brought the syringe in his hand up to his neck and drove it into his carotid artery. The instant he finished injecting its crimson contents, the heavens and earth rumbled. Gilson smirked. The smile was still frozen on his face as the floor and ceiling of his laboratory collapsed, and both he and the shadow were swallowed up by the chaos. First part end.